The deal was worth nearly $1 billion. A private dinner in Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. Velvet chairs, crystal glasses, the city skyline glowing through tall windows. But inside, the room was colder than the night outside. At the head of the table sat Alexandra Hayes, one of the most powerful women in American tech. She spoke with confidence, outlining her vision. Yet every word seemed to fall flat. The Japanese investors exchanged puzzled glances, their silence heavy with doubt. A whisper slid across the table, followed by muffled laughter. They didn't understand her. And worse, they assumed she didn't belong here. Alexandra's smile faltered. For the first time in years, she felt small in a room she was meant to command. Then, something unexpected happened. As she refilled glasses with quiet grace, Naomi Carter, the black waitress no one had paid attention to, paused. She had listened carefully to Alexandra's words and to the silence that followed them. And when the tension nearly broke the night in two, Naomi spoke. Not in English, but in flawless Japanese. The room froze. Every head turned. And for the first time that evening, Alexandra Hayes was truly heard. The dinner was meant to be history in the making, a nearly billion-dollar partnership that could redefine the future of technology. Yet, inside Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, history felt more like a trap. Crystal chandeliers threw golden light across the room, but around the polished oak table, the atmosphere was heavy, suffocating. The men leaned back in their tailored suits, their laughter sharp, their whispers sharper still. At the head of the table sat Alexandra Hayes, billionaire, visionary, a woman who had built an empire from nothing but a second-hand laptop and relentless ambition. Tonight, she wore confidence like armor, her silk dress immaculate, her voice steady as she presented her vision to the Japanese investors seated across from her. But every word she spoke landed like a stone in water, sinking into silence. The investors exchanged glances, polite but unreadable. And from the other side of the table, the quiet mockery began. "Do you think she even realizes they don't understand her?" One man muttered, lips barely moving. Another smirked. "She doesn't need to. She's just here to smile and let the men work it out." A ripple of laughter passed around the table. Quick, careful, but unmistakable. Alexandra's hand tightened around her wine glass. She didn't flinch, but inside she felt the sting. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where power didn't hide its prejudice. It dressed it in polite grins. She tried again, slowing her words, outlining the numbers, the strategy, the opportunity. But as she spoke, one of the men turned deliberately to whisper to his colleague, ignoring her completely. Another checked his watch. A third scrolled briefly on his phone, as if her billion-dollar pitch was less important than an email notification. Every small gesture was a cut, a quiet humiliation disguised as indifference. And Alexandra felt it, the unspoken judgment. She's a woman. She's American. She doesn't belong in this room. At that moment, a soft sound broke the tension, the delicate clink of water being poured into a crystal glass. Naomi Carter, a black waitress in her mid-20s, moved silently between the chairs. Her uniform was neat, her posture graceful, but she was invisible to them, as invisible as Alexandra's words had just been. But Naomi wasn't just serving. She was listening. She heard the laughter. She caught the cruel whispers. She saw Alexandra's voice dissolve into silence. And, unlike the men at the table, she understood what was happening, both the language barrier and the prejudice that filled the spaces between words. Naomi set the water pitcher down, her eyes flicking to Alexandra for just a moment. It was the smallest glance, but it carried something Alexandra hadn't felt all evening. Recognition. The laughter around the table faded, and for the first time that night, Alexandra realized she wasn't entirely alone. The meal unfolded with precision, each course delivered like a performance. Porcelain plates adorned with delicacies, glasses filled and refilled before they were ever empty. Yet the beauty of the table only sharpened the ugliness around it. The Japanese investors spoke quietly among themselves, their tone respectful but cautious. They wanted clarity. They wanted connection. And Alexandra, determined, tried again, slowing her English, shaping her sentences with care. But before her words could bridge the silence, a voice sliced through it. "She doesn't get it," whispered Trent, a silver-haired executive seated 2 chairs down. He didn't bother lowering his tone much this time. "She thinks money talks louder than culture." A chuckle answered him from Derek, the man across. "Well, maybe it does, in dollars. But let's be honest in this room. She's just a pretty face trying too hard." Their laughter was soft, but sharp enough to wound. Alexandra's back remained straight, her expression controlled, but her chest burned. She could feel the weight of every eye that wasn't on her. It was easier for them to dismiss her than to admit they didn't understand her. The humiliation deepened when one of the investors gestured politely for clarification. Alexandra leaned forward, trying again, her voice firm. But before she could finish, Derek interrupted with a false smile. "What she means is..." He twisted her words, reducing her vision to a shallow pitch. The investors nodded politely, but Alexandra saw it in their eyes. The trust was slipping away. Across the room, Naomi Carter steadied her tray, her ears catching every word. She felt the sting of it all, the dismissive tone, the cutting laughter, the way Alexandra's authority was stripped from her in silence. It was a pain Naomi knew too well, the same invisibility she carried every night in rooms like this. When she leaned in to pour another glass of water, her hand trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from anger. She wanted to speak, to break the charade, but she held her breath. Timing mattered, and tonight, Naomi knew she was standing at the edge of something far bigger than herself. The banquet glittered on, but beneath the golden glass, the judgment spread like poison. And Alexandra Hayes, a woman who had faced down Wall Street and Washington, now sat at the head of a table where power was being stolen from her one laugh, one whisper at a time. Naomi Carter moved like a shadow through the golden light of the dining room. A tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, her steps silent on the marble floor. To most at the table, she was little more than part of the decor, a uniform, a gesture, a hand refilling a glass. But Naomi heard everything. She always did. She caught the low chuckles, the snide comments tossed like knives disguised as whispers. She saw the way eyes slid past Alexandra as if she were a ghost, as if her billion-dollar mind were nothing but background noise. Naomi recognized the look, the same look she had endured her whole life. The look that said, "You don't belong here." And so, as Alexandra's voice faltered beneath the weight of indifference, Naomi felt it in her own chest. It was the ache of invisibility. Her story was different, but the wound was the same. She remembered job interviews where her name was enough to close doors. College lectures where her answers were ignored until repeated by someone else. Nights in restaurants just like this one, where she could glide between the richest men in the city and remain unseen, unacknowledged, unimportant. Naomi's eyes flicked toward Alexandra. She noticed the way the CEO's fingers tightened around her wine glass, the way her smile thinned even as she tried to keep her voice steady. She recognized the burn of humiliation hidden behind perfect posture, and Naomi felt something rise inside her. Not pity, not sympathy, recognition. For a brief moment, their gazes met, the billionaire and the waitress, two women standing at opposite ends of the power ladder. But beneath that glittering table, they were the same. Women judged before they were understood. Naomi's tray trembled just enough to make the crystal sing. She steadied it quickly, but her mind was already racing. She had a gift no one here expected, a key that could turn this dinner upside down. Still, she waited. The time wasn't right, but the storm in her chest was growing. And Naomi Carter, the invisible witness, was about to become unforgettable. The laughter had grown bolder. What began as whispers now echoed across the table, sharp and cruel, hidden behind smiles that fooled no one. Alexandra spoke once more, her voice calm but edged with desperation. Yet the men leaned back as though her words were smoke, insubstantial, meaningless. One of the investors leaned toward his colleague, confusion clouding his face. He wanted clarity. He wanted to understand. But before Alexandra could respond, Derek, the loudest of her so-called allies, cut across her with a smirk. "What she's trying to say," he began, twisting her meaning into something shallow, "is that she could deliver numbers, even if she can't deliver respect." The room erupted in soft chuckles, forks clinking against plates, champagne glasses lifted in mock toasts. Alexandra's chest tightened. Her empire had survived lawsuits, betrayals, Wall Street crashes. Yet tonight, in this room full of suits and polished smiles, she was being undone not by failure, but by contempt. And then it happened. A sound so unexpected it sliced the air in two. 彼女が言っているのは、未来を築くための信頼だということです。お金だけではなく、人の心です。The words flowed smooth, confident, in flawless Japanese. Every head turned. The voice hadn't come from Alexandra. It hadn't come from her translators or the men in suits. It came from the young black waitress standing at the corner of the table, a pitcher of water still in her hand. Naomi Carter's eyes did not waver. Her posture was steady, her voice steady. She had repeated Alexandra's vision, not just the words, but the heart behind them. The silence was deafening. Forks froze midair. The mockery died in every throat. The investors blinked, startled, then leaned forward, listening. Alexandra stared at her, stunned, her carefully guarded composure cracking into something raw, relief. For the first time that night, someone had given her back her voice. And in that single moment, Naomi Carter, the woman no one had noticed, the woman who had carried trays through rooms of power like a shadow, became the brightest presence in the room. The billion-dollar deal was no longer slipping away. It had just found its bridge. At first, no one moved. The air seemed to hold its breath, the chandeliers above casting their golden light on a room frozen in disbelief. Naomi Carter, still holding the pitcher of water, repeated Alexandra's words again in Japanese, her tone steady, her cadence respectful. This time, she did more than translate. She carried the intention, the nuance, the weight of a vision too easily dismissed. The Japanese investors leaned forward, their eyes brightening. One of them nodded slowly, then spoke back in measured Japanese. Naomi listened, then turned to Alexandra. "They want to know," she explained softly, "how you will ensure partnership, not just profit." Alexandra blinked. For the first time that evening, she wasn't alone in the silence. Her words had an anchor, a conduit. She straightened, her voice trembling only for a moment before she answered. Naomi translated, her voice flowing like water across the table, dissolving every barrier that had divided the room. The dynamic shifted visibly. Where there had been whispers, there was now attentive quiet. Where there had been laughter, there were thoughtful nods. The same men who had smirked behind their glasses now leaned in, listening to a waitress with more authority than their titles could command. Derek, the executive who had mocked her earlier, sat stiffly, his smirk erased, his power diminished. He opened his mouth once, perhaps to reclaim control, but no one looked at him. All eyes were on Naomi, the bridge no one had seen coming. As the conversation unfolded, something remarkable happened. Alexandra's words gained not only clarity, but respect. Naomi infused them with dignity. She didn't just translate sentences, she translated conviction. She made a room feel what Alexandra had meant all along, that this deal wasn't about numbers on paper, but about trust, partnership, and future. The investors began to smile, bowing their heads slightly in gestures of approval. The tide had turned. The deal was no longer slipping into silence. It was alive, breathing, anchored in the voice of a woman who had been invisible only minutes before. And as Naomi set the water pitcher back on her tray, her heart pounded. She hadn't planned to speak, but in speaking, she had changed everything. The night had shifted. What began as a performance of cruelty, with whispered jokes and sharpened laughter, was now something else entirely. The once mocking table had fallen silent, hanging on every word Naomi carried across languages. The investors, who only hours before had looked unconvinced, now leaned in with genuine curiosity, their postures softened, their voices warm. For them, Alexandra's vision was no longer a set of figures and charts. It was alive, pulsing with meaning, because Naomi had given it breath. Alexandra sat taller, her shoulders no longer heavy with shame, but lifted with renewed strength. Yet behind her polished composure, her eyes burned, not with triumph, but with something deeper, gratitude. She had known what it felt like to fight for respect in boardrooms filled with men who doubted her. But tonight, it wasn't her power that turned the tide. It was the courage of someone no one had expected to speak. When the conversation drew to a close, the investors offered their approval with bows and smiles. Papers would be signed in the days to come, but the victory had already been sealed at this table. And then, the moment no one anticipated, Alexandra rose from her chair. The rustle of her dress echoed faintly in the stillness. She turned, not to the men in suits, not to the investors, not even to her own team. She turned to Naomi Carter. Every pair of eyes followed. The waitress froze, tray in hand, her breath caught in her throat. "Tonight," Alexandra said, her voice steady but rich with emotion, "my words found their way across this room. Not because of me, but because of you." A gasp, quiet but audible, rippled across the table. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his arrogance stripped away, his face pale under the chandeliers. Alexandra continued, "You weren't just a voice. You were the bridge. The respect in this room belongs as much to you as it does to me." Naomi's throat tightened. She had spent years blending into the background, enduring invisibility as if it were part of the job. And now, in front of men who would never have spoken her name, she stood at the center of their attention, not as a servant, but as the one who had saved the night. For a long heartbeat, the room remained still. And then the applause began. Not the polite, obligatory applause of business dinners, but real, unrestrained, undeniable. The sound filled the restaurant, rolling against the crystal and marble, echoing against the skyline beyond the glass. Naomi's eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Her hands trembled, and she clutched the tray against her chest, grounding herself in the moment that felt almost unreal. The men who had laughed at Alexandra lowered their eyes now. Their mockery, their power, their certainty, all undone by the voice of a young black woman they had overlooked. And in that moment, Naomi Carter was no longer invisible. She was unforgettable. Alexandra extended her hand, not as a billionaire to an employee, but as one woman to another, united by the scars of judgment and the courage to rise above it. And as Naomi took that hand, the city outside glittered like it knew something had shifted, like the night itself had decided to remember her name.